4, 3, 2, 1, go. Welcome to the Carter Center's Roundtable. Today we are very excited for this discussion that we're going to be holding on economic rights. Are they overdue, and are they too long denied? Our guests today are distinguished leaders in the movement for the Poor People's Campaign all over this country. Our guests are also very well established as leaders in the faith community, looking at how people of faith can be involved in the moral movement for equality in this country. And let me introduce them just briefly. Our guests are Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis, Chair at the Poor People's Campaign and Director, Kairos Center at Union Seminary. And Dr. Theoharis has been at the Carter Center for our Human Rights Defenders Forum, and we met her and said, we must have you back for further discussions on this important topic. And here we are looking at these very, very difficult but important times for this discussion. We also are joined by Minister Savina Martin, statewide coordinator at the Massachusetts Poor People's Campaign and national advisor of the National Union of the Homeless. So we are so delighted to have you both for our discussion. What I wanted to just introduce for our audience is that the Carter Center has been very committed to the idea of human rights from its very inception. President Carter, when he founded the Carter Center in the mid-1980s, decided that the Carter Center should be a place where people come together to advance peace and human rights. And from his presidency, we see that his leadership, the vision that he had, was based on universal human rights for all. And when he speaks of human rights, he speaks of the full panoply of rights that were promised right after World War II in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights talks about both civil and political rights, but also economic, social, and cultural rights. They're specifically enumerated in treaties that have been adopted by member states at the UN, including the right to an adequate standard of living, the right to clean water, the right to livelihood, the right to life. All of these basic rights are encompassed in the international documents and obligations that states have to advance human rights. And that document, 1948, which was Eleanor Roosevelt helped to write and pass at the UN, was really based on Franklin Roosevelt's earlier commitment to the 4 freedoms: the freedom of belief, the freedom of expression, but also the freedom from fear and the freedom from want. These 4 freedoms framed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And we have what we believe is a complete picture of what it means for the human being to be treated by society as a whole human. Not only must they have the right to vote, but they also must have the right to life, the right to live with equality. And so today's discussion will really shift us back to this idea that there have been, this side of human rights agenda has been too long denied. And we can see this in a little bit. I'm going to just go through some of the statistics as we proceed in our discussion. But I really want to start with our 2 guests. And I would like to ask you, Reverend Dr. Theoharis, if you can talk to us about what are the basic facts about poverty in America. If we start there, and as the nation reckons with this history of systemic racial discrimination and violence, explain how this systemic racism compounds poverty and affects our ability to solve it. Can you just take it away and give us your wisdom?
Well, thanks so much for having me here, and thanks to the Forum on Human Rights at the Carter Center for all the work that you're doing in the world and across the United States. Again, I'm the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, and we, over the past 3 years, have been organizing and building power amongst poor people, low-income people, and all people of conscience who see that there shouldn't be poverty in this rich and abundant world. And yet, there are 140 million people in the United States who are poor or low income, according to US Census measures. That's almost half of the US population. It's 43.5%. 250,000, a quarter of a million people die in the United States every year because of poverty and inequality. That's almost 700 people dying every day. There are 62 million workers who are making less than the living wage. There's no town, no county, no city anywhere in this country where if you're working for the federal minimum wage full time, that you can afford to even rent a 2-bedroom apartment. There's 15 million families who are unable to afford water, even though the world is made up of 2/3 water. And I could keep on going, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, just the depth and breadth of poverty in this, the richest nation in the world, in the richest moment of human history, is untold and kind of unbelievable, right? That we have more abandoned luxury housing units in the United States than we have of upwards of about 12 million homeless people, and yet our politicians say we can't do anything in the face of this kind of widespread poverty and homelessness. You know, this nation throws away more food than it takes to not just feed everybody in this country, but to feed around the world. And yet 50% of kids are living in food insecure homes right now. And folks are waiting 6, 7, 8 hours right now during this coronavirus pandemic for a box of food to be sent home because they're waiting in these virtual and real lines, food lines. And this is, you know, to like start to get your head around the depth and breadth of this problem of poverty, and then to see that it's not because people are lazy or crazy or stupid that we have half of the US population, you know, in some form of poverty right now, and 80% of the population at some point experiencing poverty in our lifetimes, but that it's structured into the very core of our society. And when you talk about, you know, freedom from fear and want, when you talk about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that the United States is denying people in the United States and across the world economic, social, and cultural rights, as well as political and civil rights being violated every day as well. You know, this is, of course, compounded by the history of systemic racism and white supremacy, by patriarchy and the subjugation of women, by the mistreatment of indigenous nations and peoples. So of the 140 million people who are poor or low income, you know, about 67 million of those people are white. So the largest number of people who are poor in raw numbers in the United States are white. But if you look at the percentages of African Americans, it's 61% of African Americans who are poor and low income. It's 65% of Latinos. It's more than 65% of indigenous and native peoples, and it's about 60% of Asian people. And so again, you see, you know, in those numbers, the disproportionate impact of poverty, of inequality on people of color, and you can't look at those issues and hear those numbers without understanding the history of white supremacy and of systemic racism, you know, in the United States and across the world. That you have to start with, you know, what our Native brothers and sisters call the first chapter, right? The genocide of whole peoples, whole nations. You have to look at the 400 years of you know, some form of U.S. chattel slavery, you know, impacting and the policies of racism that are still enacted every day that can have 60% of African Americans poor or low income, that can have, you know, 27 states since 2010 enacting racist voter suppression laws that deny people of color and the poor to vote, and that then who gets elected or smuggled in because of racist voter suppression, you know, are politicians who then cut wages, who you know, cut environmental protections, who increase funding for military contractors and not for those that are in the front lines of wars. And so, again, what we can see is that the way that systemic racism, you know, disproportionately impacts people of color, but actually impacts everybody in this country, and makes everybody suffer and live shorter and less fruitful lives. And so, you know, this is an emergency. It was an emergency before this pandemic. This pandemic is only making it worse, deepening and spreading the kind of inequality and the poverty that is now at the very core of this nation.
Thank you. And Minister Savina Martin, the same question to you. If you could share with us your sense of the basic facts of poverty and the disproportionate effect on especially African Americans in the light of what we are facing right now, which is state violence against Black people. This is something that is really focused our attention on this unfinished tragedy in our country. And I completely take to heart and agree with everything you, Reverend Theo Harris, just said about how widespread poverty is. I think what is notable right now is that how these compounding factors have led to sort of an impunity with regard to police violence against Black people specifically that we are at least focused on right now. So talk to us, Minister Martin, about this, and what would you like to bring to our attention right now on this matter?
Right. Well, thank you all for having us here at this most important and timely discussion. And I've worked in the trenches for quite a long time. And I just like to lift my colleague and my sister in struggle, who has just been a phenomenal leader in this country in bringing all of this to light. So I thank you. We can't, I just want to say on behalf of all of our Black and brown sisters and brothers and our poor white sisters and brothers, that the trauma and violence of poverty and the violation of our very human rights in the psychological setting and condition is real. As you, Karen, began talking, I could start feeling the physiological effects. So it's not easy because it's so close to home and losing people that you love and that you love. And then this time that we live in, the dignity of death and burials and poverty is palpable. It is real, and it affects our very psyche, right? As a little girl, we always had that talk. But let me just start here and just, go over what I had today without going too deep. We are still in a collective grieving stage, and we're seeing this playing out on the airways. And that's why it's so important for us today to build these relationships and build a movement from the bottom up to help change and dismantle these conditions that we face within the United States. So over the course of many decades, we've worked with clear, brave, and committed leaders all over the US, whose stories, plight, fight, and insight unveil, just as Liz said, the complete and moral failings of the capitalist system's greed, right? We live in the midst of abundance. you know that the capitalist system is all about maximizing profits, and they have over many centuries at the expense of Black and brown bodies and at the expense of our rural white communities, poor communities that have generations of work in farming, coal mining. We've seen their health erode away without proper health care. Um, Again, the death, dying, and burial of the poor with dignity is a sin in and of its own when conditions to live are stripped away by corporate greed bailouts to the most wealthy, and the praise of corrupt and compassionate leaders who, uh, uh, who are sitting and occupying a house, who could give a care about the cries, screams, and alarm bells ringing from the hurting, the harmed, and the murders of our Black and brown brothers and sisters. I'm from Massachusetts, or Massachusetts Bay Colony, where one of our first um, brothers was killed, right? Back in the 1700s. He was shot down, a young man. History says it was 5 of them who were taunting the men in the redcoats or the British. And this gentleman is known as Crispus Attucks or Crispus Attucks, who is an indigenous and Black man. And when he was shot, the alarm bells rang, and several days later, as history tells us, here comes the Revolutionary War. So the US is a commodity producing society, a capitalist system. And every commodity contains, let me just frame this here, a certain amount of value. And could it be that the human being today is not valued? The slave trade was big business. Black bodies were traded, their labor exploited, they were auctioned, bought and sold, traded like a Wall Street stock. And forced labor had them on the plantations for years. Today in Massachusetts, over 400 years later, it is known that the Blacks in Boston, and this is according to the Color of Wealth study, that our net worth today in Boston is $8, compared to our white counterparts of $247,000. Something is wrong. The enslaved were a value commodity. This type of exploitation and labor violence was threaded throughout our US history. Chinese labor and railroads, agriculture and immigrant labor, same template. The capitalist system has now produced, as we're seeing, 140 million poor and low wealth working class families. And among the ranks of the poor are homeless men, women, and children who are $400 emergency away from homelessness. The value of a human being in this society, if you're poor or no wealth, is an indictment into a debtor's prison, low wage paying jobs, lack of adequate health care, health stresses, and environmental illnesses like asthma, diabetes, and high blood pressure. And in the 1980s, the National Union of the Homeless was mobilizing and organizing on the heels of witnessing, you know, at that time, a heating up of the economy and at the same time, a growth of homelessness. Heading into the 90s, we saw, you know, the social, we were experiencing huge dislocations in the most impoverished communities. We organized around 25 states across the country. But today it is reported that there are nearly 600,000 homeless men and women on the streets on any given night. And we know that there's much, much more, right? As Liz pointed out. When we began organizing many years ago, we focused on poverty as a defining issue of our time. At the Poverty Initiative, the motto, teach as we fight, Liz, learn and lead, drawn from lessons and the theoretical and practical educational methods to address the root causes of poverty and build a social movement to eliminate it. And in the richest country of the world, sleeping on the sidewalk with your entire family, begging for food is inhumane. In some cases, children are taken from their parents rather than locating a family into an apartment. So and wrapping up the social conditions yesterday as well as today, unveiled the moral failure of this country's neglect to provide the basic necessities for people to live in. And we saw that over this weekend with the Poor People's Campaign. The poor are not valued for themselves to earn profits. However, shelter providers earn hundreds of thousands of dollars to turn shelters and profit-making poor houses, just as jails exploit the poor, our Black and brown bodies to earn a profit. I mean, to have the jails bet on Wall Street to keep the jails filled is is a violation of our human rights in and of itself. Mm-hmm. So we have been left with the choice to build, no choice, but with the choice to build a movement from the bottom up and to continue to mobilize and educate the least of these into a new and unsettling force in this nation to fight against the violation of our human right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And, and just wrapping that qualitative piece up, it's a violation in and of itself of our rights to life.
Well, thank you, Minister Martin. That was very illuminating for us to think about, the United States is a capitalist. Much of the post-Cold War world has moved in the direction of neoliberal capitalism. And we can look at the results, all these years later from you talked about the beginning of your campaign in the 80s. What we know from the research is that before the 1980s, up until about 1981 or 1982, when Ronald Reagan came into office, you saw a shared prosperity between World War II, the end of World War II, and about 1981, 82. You could see that there was growth in all the income brackets. There was a sort of every group was improving to some degree. And then starting around 1982, you could see that wealth gap begin to grow. And now what was, a graph like this, the wealth concentration has gone so high up that it's just actually obscene to look at it. And we know that this has very specific and practical impacts on real people. When the median income of a white family is around $117,000, median income of a Black family is around 20,000. I can't remember, it's in the Washington Post article that we've linked here, of a Black family comparing that wealth gap. So these have very specific impacts. Now, my question is, we titled this program Economic Rights Too Long Denied, right? What would have happened, do you think? And what could happen now? We can look back, but we can also look forward. If we were to frame these questions as a matter of rights, because FDR, as we know, tried to push an ambitious New Deal that would be encompassing of a number of rights to recognize the freedom from want. One item that he secured, that he was able to achieve, was Social Security insurance. So this program has been very successful to keep elderly people out of extreme poverty. It's just one program. Medicare was added later to bring health insurance for the elderly. So if we were to think about all the issues you've discussed, Minister Martin, as economic rights questions, how should we move forward to say, if we have a right to life, a right to health, a right to an adequate standard of living, that would mean there would be no homeless. We would have programs that would obligate the state to intervene. We see sometimes people throw out red herrings when we talk about economic rights. Senator Rand Paul says, well, if there's a right to healthcare, that means I, as a physician, am going to be conscripted and I'm going to be forced to give healthcare to people for free. So this is this is a canard. This is some kind of way that people who don't like the idea of economic rights try to change the discussion. But what economic rights really means is that the state takes as its obligation to say, wow, we have 600,000 plus homeless. We have an obligation. That means, oh, maybe we need to expand Section 8, access to Section 8, and make it easier for people to be housed. Maybe it means we have to guarantee healthcare for every person. So these have policy implications if we put on the lens of economic rights as opposed to aspirations, or as opposed to the ideology that we've had so far, which is rising tide lifts all boats, stock market is high, therefore everybody's doing great. We can see that's not true. So let me ask each of you, what would it mean? Why is it important to discuss economic rights in this conversation of poverty and systemic racism? And how does this language and framing change our approach? Dr. Theo Harris.
So, I think using the human rights framework and approaching the needs and demands of the 140 million people as rights is the only way to do it. What we're seeing is that it doesn't have to be this way, right? The Poor People's Campaign came forward with a moral budget a year ago, and we actually put out a moral justice jubilee policy platform during our mass Poor People's Assembly and Moral March on Washington. And what we do in that policy platform in our budget is just what you're talking about, of putting forth economic rights as rights, and rights that have their history back in the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but also in the Declaration of Independence, right? The right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Dr. King said, as he was launching a Poor People's Campaign more than 50 years ago, is what good is it to have the right to sit at a lunch counter if people can't afford to buy the hamburger? And he said, that you're basically strangling, right? And we should think about strangling and the strangulation that's in the air right now with COVID-19, with police and state violence against Black and brown bodies. But you're strangling people when you don't pay the right to a living wage, when you don't guarantee that folks can have not just what they barely need to survive, but to thrive. And so, I think this conversation about rights and outcomes, therefore, guarantees, therefore, and not just the opportunity to potentially, access some little provision here or there. The fact that, we've seen $3 trillion in this pandemic go, and 85% of that money has gone to bail out the rich and Wall Street and the corporations, and that we really don't have the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness for the vast majority of people. The fact that we're living in a society and at a time when they can cut people off of any social programs, not provide housing, not guarantee living wages. That it doesn't have to be this way. And so, we have to build a movement that can shift, can kind of build the power to be able to make these demands for our rights to be realized. And we have to see them as the God-given rights that they are, and that it isn't inevitable that we have poverty, that God and our society doesn't want it to be this way, and that it's our responsibility as a society to, what we say in this campaign, of lift from the bottom, where we see that everybody rises, right? Not that trickle down works, not just that a rising tide lifts all boats. What we've seen over the past 40, 50 years, as you were describing, is that, the tide is rising some boats and it's sinking the rest of us, right? some yachts who are sinking the rest of us. And that right now, what we have is a system where you can have the richest people in the country and world making $500 billion off of a pandemic when we have untold suffering and misery amongst the vast majority of people. And so, we have rights, and we have the right to protest and to advocate for those rights. And that's what people are doing in heroic and bold ways across the country, is organizing and raising our voices that we all have the right to live. And that means universal single-payer healthcare. That means living the right to a job at a living wage. That means a guaranteed adequate income. That means the right to decent education all the way up through college that is free and accessible and open for all. That means that we don't have to have stealing from Peter to pay Paul over here, and that we don't have to pit immigrants against the families of the incarcerated, against domestic violence survivors. But in fact, we have the resources in this society to make everybody have a full and abundant life. And so let us make it so.
Well, that's perfect. And as we come back to the next question after this, I'd love for you to get into the platform for the Moral March on Washington that was last weekend and talk about that a bit. But before that, I'd like to hear from Minister Savina Martin the same question. What would it mean to frame this as an economic rights matter? How will that help us to advance these goals?
Right. Yeah. Again, we pride ourselves, and this is why I just love the Poor People's Campaign, and since the day we launched in 2017, and even before that. But poverty is a lot of hard work, right? It takes a lot of work for a mom with 3 or 5 children to figure out, education, just living a good, adequate, decent life, that we should be entitled to as human beings on this planet. It takes a lot of work. And so the Poor People's Campaign has, again, unveiled all of that. We've actually heard from the people that are affected by this. In particular, our veterans, right? Our veterans go to war in this country. I was a part of a poverty draft, right? I didn't get drafted into combat, but I went in thinking that, okay, well, I'll be able to provide. Not so. I mean, there are so many factors that go into it. If a combat veteran fights at home and has to return back to the same conditions that led he or she into combat, I mean, something is wrong. So what the Poor People's Campaign has done, starting with the Souls of Poor Folks, right, the 50 years audit, we're just asking people to, read up on it, study it. And I don't want to go ahead of the questions, but, this is what we're about, right? And the moral budget speaks to economics. I mean, look at the military-industrial complex, right? Where all that money lies, right? You could take an F-18 fighter jet and probably end homelessness, build housing. That 53 cents, why should it be taken out of our dollars when, they've got all of this money, our money, and extracting the resources that we need when we come back from war, or we get out of a hospital, or we need our healthcare paid for, our education paid for. So, this is the fight that we're up against. And we need to continue to do more educating and more registering. It's all about our economic base and mobilizing from the bottom up, just because we have a right to live. We have a right to thrive. And these demands that are so beautifully laid out, it speaks to the fight, right? And the insight and the education that we've been engaged in for many years.
Oh, thank you. And it just reminds me a few years, I think when you were at the Carter Center, Reverend Theo Harris, I'm not sure if this was the topic, but a few years ago, we had a whole focus on this idea of divesting from violence and investing in human rights and peace. And it sounds like defund the police. At least that's what I know, that what it sounds like to me that the protesters are saying. It doesn't mean that we don't need community security of some kind. It's reinvesting, it's divesting from the machinery of violence. That could be militarized police forces, but it's also our military overseas. That we have a machinery of violence and we have normalized violence in our culture and in our society. President Carter has written about this repeatedly, about the normalization of violence and how it shows up in all these ways in our society. An F-18, well, an F-35, I think costs $1 billion, $1 billion. You could, pay for all the free college tuition, with one fighter jet, as you say. These are priorities. And if we treat human beings as valuable, as you say, Minister Martin, you said, what is our value? This is the opportunity we have in our country to recalibrate what is of value. And what this program is about is how could we recenter the human being, the whole human being, every human being, as the preoccupation of our concern of what is most valuable. And so I wanted to ask Reverend Theo Harris, to both of you each, you talked about the moral budget, you talked about the moral March on Washington last week. If you can go through the points of the platform, what are you calling for? Because I would like to give our audience some idea of how they can get involved, how they can begin to be educated on these issues. I also remember something that you said when you were at the Carter Center a few years ago, when you talked about how religious figures are distorting the message of Christ himself about poverty, and why it's important for people of faith to stand up and fight this fight together, not conceding to poverty, but realizing that the larger message of Christ is about radical love, which could never just concede to human suffering, right? So over to you, Reverend Theo Harris.
So I really appreciate this question, and indeed the Poor People's Campaign has put out a Poor People's Moral Budget and a Moral Justice Jubilee policy platform that actually speaks to exactly how we're proposing with the demands that are coming out of communities across this country, with policy think tanks and economists that have worked with us to say that not only is it possible, not only can we actually change this kind of war economy, the militarization of our communities, into a peace economy and into a justice-filled society and world, but it actually costs us as a nation less to do so, right? And so what we're proposing in our budget and in our policy platform is that if you cut the military budget by half, making this nation still have a larger military than any of the countries in the world combined, right? But also increasing security in this country and around the world, and cutting wars and the militarization of our communities. If we have a fair taxation system, right, a system where those who can afford taxes pay the most taxes. Right now we have a system where undocumented immigrants pay more in taxes for not being able to get Social Security or any other benefits than the richest 1%, right? And so we have a fair taxation system, a system that actually could even return us to taxation systems of this country's past. If we forgive debts, right? Forgive the debt, the kind of student debt, you were speaking to, like, just one military contract could basically cancel all of student debt. Just the first payment of the stimulus to Wall Street could have forgiven all of student debt. But if we forgive debts, and understand this principle, this economic principle, that debts that can't be paid won't be repaid, right? I mean, just that we've looked, and if we invest our nation's great resources in things like early childhood education, what we know is that every dollar spent in early childhood education saves our nation $7 in the future, right? Every job created feeding people through food programs, through SNAP, produces 8 times more jobs than any job that we have in the military, right? I mean, so and we have all of this material, all of this data, all of these stats that are there for people's, to know and to see. And so I encourage folks to go to the Poor People's Campaign website and to read actually in full this moral budget, to read in full the summary of this policy platform, where we talk about, what it looks like and what it costs our nation. And actually how those costs are so much less than the suffering and death and economic stagnation because of inequality, because of poverty, and why economic rights are so needed, both to save people's lives, to save the soul of our nation and democracy, but then also to help this economy be what it could be for so many. And I do want to speak a little bit to this idea that we talk about interlocking injustices in the Poor People's Campaign. We start with the issue of systemic racism connected to poverty, to ecological devastation, and to militarism and the war economy. And then what we say that what helps tie all of those interlocking injustices together is a false, a distorted moral narrative, a moral narrative that blames poor people, blames people of color and immigrants for all of society's problems, that tries to pit us against each other, and that feeds us this lie of scarcity. That it can't be any better than this, when we actually are living in a world and a society that has beautiful abundance, that's just not being realized by the vast majority of people. And so we do take on these so-called religious leaders who speak about issues like Jesus was a card-carrying member of the NRA, and that the real moral issues of our day are same-sex marriage, when the Bible talks about, and our sacred texts and traditions across the world's religions talk about, caring for the poor, caring for the children. The idea that Jesus traveled around the country, setting up free healthcare clinics, never charging a leper a copay, right? And that these are the real issues of our day, and that if we're called to live into those traditions, to take those sacred texts seriously, then we'll see that the only way to honor and worship God is to welcome your immigrant neighbor, to organize society around the needs of the poor and the homeless, and to spread, Jubilee and Sabbath and livelihood and abundance for everyone. Because that's, again, what's at the core, the center, the 2,500 passages in the Hebrew and Christian Bibles that are about the poor. And that if you cut that out, if you cut that core of taking care of the vulnerable out, the whole Bible falls apart. And yet, right now we have, as Dr. Barber, the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign with me, says, we have religious leaders praying, praying for, so-called elected leaders who are praying, preying over the poor. And that is, exactly what the prophets come out against throughout the Bibles. Isaiah 10, woe to you who pass unjust laws, making women and homeless children your prey, right? I mean, this is This is not me saying this. This is the Bible. We could go to Jeremiah. We could just go throughout, James 5, the wages you have failed to pay your workers cry out against you. Their cries have reached the ear of God, right? I mean, and again, we could keep on going. But over and over again throughout our faith traditions is this siding with the poor and marginalized, and coming out against the evil of a society that prioritizes the rich and powerful over the needs and demands of the poor.
Well, I would say preach. That's fantastic. That's exactly what I wanted to hear from you. And Minister Sabina Martin, you said that we live in the midst of abundance, yet we see this poverty. Building on what Reverend Theo Harris has just said, talk about that. Is that a sin? Is that a sin against each other? Is that a sin against God? Tell us, what do you think?
Preach it, Reverend Liz. I feel it. I think of, just like Liz said, the prophets of today and the disciples on the ground. We're seeing everything unfold if we look through the biblical lens, right? Our scaffolding, our wonderful faith leaders and prophetic councils across the country that so clearly lay this out so we can, understand it, as they say, in the flesh, right? We're seeing so much unfold. So at that execution of, if I can go here for a moment, of George Floyd, that we saw play out from the time the soldiers came and picked him up and arrested him, right? I think of the vision, if you will, of how the Roman soldiers came to arrest Jesus. And what that looked like to the people back then as they walked with him through those stations. And he had the burden of and was beaten and bludgeoned in public. It was a public execution. And to see this happen, and then the tipping point happened when it affected the entire world. Mm-hmm. And we see the change. And then beforehand, before all this happened, we have the Poor People's Campaign that dug this stuff up. The word poverty. We spoke about shifting the moral narrative. We spoke about a revival, a moral revival in this country. And we're seeing this happen. We're seeing it happening all over the country on the heels of what we've done just this past weekend. This last public execution, and then another one came, that was the last nail in the coffin. And we're hoping and we're praying as we continue to mobilize, organize, register, and educate our folks all over the country, the 140 million strong, that we can, raise the bottom. And because when the bottom is raised, everybody rises. Yeah, I mean, I'll just leave that there. My sister laid it all out, and we could just go on and on, right? There's so much to unpack. Defunding the police too. We should really think about what that means, and connecting these interlocking injustices to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and also to the Constitution. We need to really look and study the 13th Amendment even much deeper, because therein lies a vault that we need to unpack as well. We need to be really careful when we say defund. What does that mean? Where these resources? Yeah,
I think that it sometimes you have to use let's just say exciting rhetoric to get people's attention. And so people are talking about it. And my understanding is certainly that that there is a desire to shift our strategies for community safety. We have to reimagine community safety, that we have overemphasized the hard edge of the state. and that without addressing poverty and inequality and all of the underlying factors, in Ferguson, what was the uprising about in Ferguson after Michael Brown was killed? Part of the frustration was that people had been, in Ferguson, every household had an average of 3 warrants out. You had high fines for petty offenses. That was just creating this atmosphere of domination and intimidation in the community. And it was in a Black community. It was really focused in a way that created these tensions. So it's a reprioritization is the way I think of defunding the police, or divesting. The language that we used 3 years ago at our forum was divesting from violence and investing in human rights and peace, right? So that's the focus that we have had. If we go down that road, you mentioned the 13th Amendment, and we have a question, fortunately, from the audience, which I'm excited about. But you mentioned the 13th Amendment. One of my commitments as a white woman in America, as a white American woman, is to welcome my white brothers and sisters to self-educate, to educate ourselves about the realities. One thing I've been asking my friends and family to do is to watch the movie 13th. You just mentioned the 13th Amendment, Minister Martin. That the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery, also has a loophole in it that allows for continued incarceration of people that has been weaponized against Black people in this country. And it is a very important set of information that many people do not have. So one request I'm making to everyone, especially my white brothers and sisters, is to watch the movie 13th. It's on Netflix, etc. So to educate ourselves. Okay, here's a question that's come from the audience. So much of religion has developed by controlling men for their own benefit. Because of that, I cannot accept that care of, for the poor, and the wonderful things that Dr. Theo Harris spoke of is based on those same religions as the basis for a moral budget, or full recognition and implementation of universal human rights. Where else can I turn for engagement other than a religious-based movement? I'll turn that over to Reverend Theo Harris, but before I do, let me say that we certainly are not saying religion is the only framework. President Carter has said that people of faith need to step up. People of faith need to go deeper into their traditions to stand for justice. And actually, what would happen if people of faith really did that? You would have a moral uprising, I think. So anyway, over to you, both of you, for that question.
So I just want to agree that, even the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, is made up of people of faith and lots of people that do not have faith, but who believe in the arc of justice that is throughout this universe, right? And that we go back to our traditions, whether it's the Constitution, whether it's different movements of people most impacted by injustice that have led, as well as other pieces of history where poor people have kind of been able to come together and band together and build a nation that actually is about meeting people's needs. And so yes, myself, I'm a Christian pastor. I'm a biblical scholar, but I find myself, in this very counterintuitive movement that has coal miners in Kentucky and poor moms from the Mississippi Delta, with atheists and agnostics and Hindus and Buddhists and Jewish folk and Christians, and so many others who are saying that our people, somebody's been hurting our people for far too long, and we won't be silent anymore. So I know that in the Poor People's Campaign, we have a place for you. No matter whether you come from a perspective of Universal Declaration of Human Rights, whether you center your work on the history of change in different countries of the world, or if you do come from a perspective that sees that throughout history, there's always been a theological battle going on. That at the same time as slaveholders created a Bible that took out the Exodus, that took out the prophets, and that took out any reference of the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, who's anointed me to preach good news to the poor and freedom for the captive and slave. At the same time as Harriet Moses Tubman, appealed to a higher law and calling and said, that I am in the tradition of those who go ahead and lead my people into freedom and liberation. And so there's always been this battle. Those in power have always used religion, and especially Christianity, to justify grave and deep injustices. And people have always also come up and said that isn't true. But again, we have to engage in that Bible, especially myself as someone who does profess to be a person of faith. And we need absolutely everybody to be in a movement that thinks that everybody has a right to live. And before we all go down to jail, and let this campaign fail, that we'll be out there protesting and raising and using all of the means that are at our disposal to kind of work for a more just society for everyone.
Perfect. And same question to you, Minister Martin. Do you think that it's important to engage the faith discourse? Do you have any words of caution or wisdom on how to do that well and what it's meant for you?
I just want to say that, Reverend Liz, you just encapsulated it and laid it out. But I will add that in the spirit of Harriet Moses Tubman, we have on board with us prolific abolitionists, right? I just want to lift up even Colleen Russell McCoy and her husband for just a great teaching on abolition. So the Poor People's Campaign is a home. We welcome everyone. It's a teaching platform as well as an take action platform. And so I'll just stop there. And yes,
wonderful.
Whoever wrote, you are totally welcome.
Yeah, that's great. So we only have a couple of minutes left. I just want to give you each a final word to provide some advice and guidance for our audience. How can people get involved? How can they connect with the movement? And is there anything, especially if there's anything specifically you would have people do immediately? Reverend Theo Harris.
So if people are interested in the Poor People's Campaign and joining, you can go to poorpeoplescampaign.org or june2020.org and register, sign up right there. If you like to text, you can text the word moral, M-O-R-A-L, to 90975 and sign up to be involved. We're asking people right now to send this Moral Justice to Believe policy platform to all of our elected officials. So if you're in the United States, please register and then send those demands, send that platform to our elected officials. And
before you move on from that, can you just run down the list real quick, just like bullet point those demands?
Yeah, so the demands are in 5 different categories. They're around systemic racism, systemic poverty, the health in our environment, and this kind of war economy and militarized communities, as well as just the kind of adequate standard of living. And so it's everything from voting rights to universal single-payer healthcare, everything from
Sorry, keep going.
It's everything from, all of these different issues. And a lot of times people will say to us, well, don't you think you're asking for too much? And, to us, the response is that, in this pandemic, we've seen those that are rich and powerful ask for 3 trillion things. So why are you asking the poor just to ask for one? So we have a very full platform. It's bold, it's visionary, it's coming out of those that are most impacted. And we would love for people to engage with it, send it to your elected officials, and then get involved in the work of the campaign going forward.
Perfect. Minister Martin, over to you. Any additional advice or guidance? What would you have folks do today?
I would just say to be on the lookout. I think between June 28th and July 5th, we're hosting Zoom calls with all of our new folks. If anyone from Massachusetts, from the Poor People's Campaign in Massachusetts, has chimed in, which I know we have had 32 so far RSVPs and counting, we're hosting our Zoom call on July 2nd. So just be on the lookout for information. Go to the Poor People's Campaign webpage and find out from your state where to chime in at.
Wonderful. And I'd like to invite both of you to come back and give us an update. We can schedule a future meeting with you or others from the Poor People's Campaign. We'd love to continue to have this dialogue and see if we can really seize this moment to make progress and to communicate with our lawmakers. Just one last word. I think we saw from the results on Tuesday from the elections, there are big ideas in the air, and progressive candidates are picking up on ideas around justice and equality and economic rights. So I think that's a positive thing within the political sphere. So we will continue this discussion. Thank you all. Thank you to the audience. Thank you most of all to our panelists, Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis and Minister Savina Martin. Thank you for joining us. And until next time, we'll see you at the Carter Center.